Thank you for having me. Very glad to be here. Very glad to talk about ROR and ORCID, which I very much emphatically believe are indeed better together. So I'm going to begin with just a little bit of a ROR refresher about what it is, and then I'm going to talk specifically about how ORCID and ROR have worked together in the past and continue to work together. And then I'm going to show you some examples of systems that are really leveraging ROR and ORCID to create better metadata for the entire research ecosystem. So first of all, as many of you very likely know, as you indicated in the poll, ROR, the Research Organization Registry, is a global community-led registry of open persistent identifiers for research organizations. We are an established, trusted, widely adopted, no-cost service that is becoming a standard in scholarly communication and scholarly publishing. You are all familiar, I am sure, with the DOI, the Digital Object Identifier, which is an identifier for research outputs. Canonically, the journal article, but also a data set, even a presentation, things like that. Research outputs come in many forms, and the DOI has been an essential part of making sure that those research outputs can be shared and preserved for the long term. ORCID, of course, as we all know, is an identifier for researchers, and ROR, which is the most recent of these three, is an identifier for research organizations. So together these make up a really key and nearly comprehensive, although not perhaps exclusively comprehensive, set of identifiers that help create a knowledge graph with connections between research outputs, researchers, and research organizations. This is an example of a ROR record. The ROR ID itself is in the upper left of this record, which is, this is really just a web version of the ROR ID, although of course we do offer a free API and a totally free downloadable data set, but we do also offer a nice web search here at ror.org/search. So here you can see the ROR ID itself in that upper left, the name of this organization, Virginia Tech, what kind of organization it is, other names for the organization, including names in other languages. Here on this record, you can see the alias, meaning sort of a nickname, an alternate name for this institution is Virginia Polytechnic Institute and State University, tagged with as an English name. And that is actually the official name for the organization that many, many people call Virginia Tech. You can see where this organization is located. You can even retrieve latitude and longitude from ROR if you like, this organization's website, other identifiers for this organization, and relationships, child organizations of Virginia Tech, related organizations, all of which have their own ROR record, and those relationships are captured within the ROR record and the ROR data. We just topped 115,000 ROR records quite recently. So we have slightly more than 115,000 active, inactive, and withdrawn records in ROR. And as I mentioned, all of this data is freely available. Here's the problem that ROR solves. As I mentioned, the organization where I used to work, known as Virginia Tech, is, when you have, for instance, a journal article, a research output, and a submission system or some other kind of system says, hey, where are you affiliated? If that data is captured as free text, some people might type Virginia Tech, some people might type Virginia Polytechnic State Institution, and in discovery systems like this one, which is a real one that shall remain nameless, that means that you find it very, very difficult to associate those research outputs with that institution. And so that project of making sure that those organization names are connected to a single organization is called disambiguation. And that is one of the major problems that ROR solves. This is also very much the case for organizations that are very commonly referred to by names in different languages. So in non-English speaking countries, many of them have researchers who will give the name of the organization in English. but the name of the organization is also in the most commonly used language in that country. And that can create this kind of ambiguity in discovery systems and research systems. So here is an example of how these two different forms of the name for Virginia Tech, Virginia Polytechnic Institute, and here is Virginia Tech accompanied with a department string. These are both mapped to ROR IDs, which means that in the ORCID records for these authors, they are both reliably associated with the same organization, even though they have entered completely different strings into this manuscript submission system, which has then made it through to this discovery system. So in ORCID, as you can see here, we know that both of these authors are affiliated with the exact same university because the ROR ID for Virginia Tech is a reliable, unique identifier for that organization. This is typically how ROR works. A user submits something in a system that is integrated with ROR, and usually behind the scenes, that user selects their institution from a ROR-powered controlled list, and that means that that ROR ID is in metadata, including in things like ORCID records, and then other systems that use ROR IDs can group those together and make sure that all of the items that it's tracking are associated with the correct institution. Now, how can ROR be free? How can it be entirely free and open? ROR is non-commercial and sustainable, and ROR itself is actually not an organization. ROR is a collaborative initiative that is operated by the California Digital Library and Crossref and DataCite as part of each organization's ongoing operational budget. We don't depend on grants or fees. We cannot be transferred to a commercial entity. We are a signatory to the Principles of Open Scholarly Infrastructure, which specifies those things. And ROR is just considered as such an important part of research information that Crossref, DataCite, CDL, and as we'll see, ORCID are very much willing to support it because it makes metadata better throughout the entire world. So now I want to talk a little bit about ORCID's really wonderful support for ROR over the years. This is a general high-level history of ROR. There were 3 years of meetings, working groups, requests for information, all kinds of activities from 2016 to 2018 under the umbrella of what was then called the ORG ID initiative, planning ROR. What should it look like? How should it function? What should its scope be, all that kind of thing. And then we launched what we call the minimum viable registry for ROR in January of 2019. So ROR is now a little bit more than 6 years old. From 2019 to 2022, we had what we call a startup phase. We had early adopters of ROR. We were getting ROR into metadata schemas like Crossref and DataCite. All kinds of sort of initial activities. And then really just in the last 2 to 3 years, we've been seeing increased ROR adoption tremendously. Lots and lots of systems adopting ROR, really especially but not exclusively in the data and repository space. Lots of people making use of ROR, and we only expect that to grow in the future. So ORCID was very much involved in the early days of ROR. ORCID was a key partner in the ORG ID initiative. They helped define what ROR should be. And then in 2018, when we were first beginning about actually creating something, ORCID worked very closely with DataCite and Crossref to draft a proposal for a pilot, that initial release that met the requirements that had been so carefully drawn out over those 3 years. And then ORCID, DataCite, Crossref, and the California Digital Library formed a steering group to implement the pilot, which launched with the wonderful name ROR, Research Organization Registry, which is a name I love, in January of 2019. And I think this is a bit more fuzzy and squishy, but I think that it's really true that ORCID did a lot of work to help educate the research community about the value of persistent identifiers, how that really could enrich metadata, enrich the scholarly ecosystem, make it possible to build things that otherwise wouldn't be possible. So I think we have really benefited sort of indirectly from ORCID's success, because sometimes when we tell people, when I'm trying to explain work to people, I say, well, it's like ORCID, but for research organizations, and then people really understand what I'm talking about. So we're very grateful to ORCID for that. ORCID itself first began using ROR in 2021. They posted something on our blog post about that. And ORCID has really been, I think, just a model citizen in terms of not just integrating ROR into its system, but using it to build additional features that I think Tom will talk about that are creating real value within ORCID. So we've been very, very pleased to see that. This is my own chart. I think Tom will probably show you some as well, but we've been tracking the prevalence of ROR IDs in ORCID records. And quite recently, ROR IDs have become the most common organizational identifier within ORCID, and we only anticipate that that will grow. And then, very importantly, ORCID has continued to financially support ROR. These are two blog posts on the ORCID blog about ORCID's financial support for ROR in 2023 and 2024. These blog posts do a great job of explaining exactly why ROR is really important for the work that ORCID does. And we are very grateful. So thank you to ORCID. Now I wanted to just go just for a few minutes more and talk a little bit about systems that are using ROR and ORCID so you can really kind of see this in action. There are many, many systems that use ROR, and I have not checked every single item on this list, but I would bet you $1,000 that every single one of these systems listed here that uses ROR also uses ORCID. It's very, very common for systems that are newly adopting ROR to already have an ORCID integration, and for that to be a key infrastructural feature that these systems provide. These are only a few of the systems that offer ROR. We can't list all of them, but we do have a more comprehensive list on our website. And this is just sort of one of the ways ROR is typically used. So again, ROR is somewhat different from ORCID in that individuals cannot update ROR records. And in fact, we tend not to do a lot of outreach to researchers in particular, because researchers really have very little control over their own ROR ID. Anyone can suggest a change to a ROR ID. If you say this name is wrong, or here's an additional name, or here's additional information about this organization within the ROR record, anyone can do that. All you need to do is go to ror.org/search and suggest that. But that goes through a centrally curated process at ROR. And in that sense, ROR is unlike ORCID, where it's more of a distributed model where individual researchers are expected to create and maintain their own ORCID records. And so then similarly, ROR's adoption model is a bit different in that what ROR is really trying to do is get into systems. So here's a system, Dryad, which is a generalist data repository. And you might notice that you can't see ROR anywhere on this GIF, but this institutional lookup is powered by the ROR API. You can see my ORCID ID on this record right there. We've got the little ORCID logo. But we have some systems that do display the ROR logo. We have many more systems that don't, because, as I mentioned, individual researchers honestly don't need to know that much about ROR. Systems need to adopt ROR to make this kind of institution lookup easier. And then on the back end in Dryad metadata, that institutional affiliation is connected to the ROR ID, which makes value for everyone. Here's another example of that, this time from a publishing system. Scholastica is a very widely used system in publishing, a really nice modern system, and they were a very early ROR adopter. And similarly, you don't see the ROR ID anywhere here. You do see a field that is named ORCID ID. The researcher is expected to enter their ORCID ID there. But here, this form also is powered by ROR. This institution lookup is using the ROR API to suggest organizations here. And then when the author selects that, all of that ROR metadata that's attached to the ROR ID is there in the background and can go through the publication process. And then here's an integration that is coming this year. OJS, Open Journal Systems, is one of the most widely used publishing systems in the world. It's very widely used outside of the US and Europe, as well as in the US and Europe and Canada. And here you can see the ROR logo, but similarly in the forthcoming version of OJS, which is due out later this year, probably in about a couple of months, OJS version 3.5 has ROR built into the functionality of the system to where contributors to an article on a PKP, an OJS hosted journal, can look up their institutional affiliation, select it from suggestions powered by the ROR API, and save that into metadata, where it can then go into Crossref, into DataCite, places like that, and be used by anyone who's looking for that data. And this is a slightly unusual little integration, but just recently, just last week, we at ROR partnered with Rogue Scholar, which is an initiative to create DOIs for blog posts, especially, scholarly blog posts, people who are doing scholarly blogging. So we have created and assigned DOIs for all of the ROR blog posts, and we've also altered our Atom feed, the feed that can power readers and things like that. And so here on the left, you can see our Atom data. And so for every blog post on the ROR blog, there is an author. You can see here the most recent post on the ROR, or one of the most recent posts on the ROR blog. This is Atom data. You can see that I am the author. There's my ORCID ID. Another blog post was authored by my colleague, Adam Buttrick, who is affiliated with CDL. I am affiliated with Crossref. Adam is affiliated with CDL, which is part of the University of California Office of the President. And then on Rogue Scholar, those ROR blog posts are saved in a community, and Rogue Scholar extracts the ROR ID from those author ORCID IDs to generate this faceted browse by author affiliation. So I think other systems do that as well. I would love to know more. If you have a system that is extracting ROR IDs or affiliations from ORCID records, I would love to learn about it, because I know a lot of systems are doing that. This just happens to be one that I'm most recently familiar with. So I thought I would show you that. And then finally, I am employed by Crossref, as I mentioned. Crossref metadata is used by probably tens of thousands of systems. Everyone is using Crossref metadata who is building a scholarly index, lots and lots of tools. And if you are a Crossref member, if you're a publisher or an institution who is a member of Crossref, you can go to Crossref's participation reports to check the health and quality of your metadata. And both ORCID IDs and ROR IDs are really key metrics in what Crossref considers to be good, complete metadata. Crossref has just launched a new initiative for metadata awards, so you'll be hearing a little bit more about that, and we'll be congratulating and honoring people for providing good metadata that is open for use by the entire global research community. And that's all from me. I'm going to hand it over to Tom now. Tom?
Brilliant. Thanks, Amanda. Yeah, hopefully I won't cover too much of the same ground. But yeah, I'll be talking about this, the same topic basically, but from the ORCID perspective. So I'm going to give a little ORCID introduction, and then talk about the touch points and connections between ORCID and ROR. Where are we using it within our user interfaces and our APIs and things like that? And then I'm going to talk a little bit about the use cases, again, touching on similar things to Amanda, and then hopefully we can move on to some Q&A after that. So for those that don't know, and I imagine most people in this webinar do know, ORCID's mission is to enable transparent and trustworthy connections between researchers and their contributions. And importantly for this discussion in this webinar, their affiliations, right? By providing this unique persistent identifier for individuals to use throughout their careers. And we do that in a number of ways. through these three main services, right? So we provide the ORCID ID, which I think everyone here will be familiar with, which is a unique persistent identifier, free for all researchers to use and to create. We provide an ORCID record, which is the digital CV or profile, all the metadata that's attached to that ORCID ID, which again can include employment, which has RORs, education, which can have RORs, funding, peer review, research outputs, and all sorts of other metadata as well, including email domain metadata, which I'll talk about in a bit. And we also can provide a set of APIs and an annual data file so that machines can interact with the information in the registry. So as Amanda touched on, ORCID does solve name ambiguity for people. It's one of the primary benefits of ORCID. There's a lot of people with the same name, so similar to institutions. You can write them in different orders. So you can have D Smith and Dave Smith and DA Smith and all these different things. And text matching just isn't very good for working those things out. Names can also swap order depending on your location. So yeah, we help to solve the name ambiguity for people. This slide's misnamed. It's actually ROR, solves name ambiguity for organizations. And there's a little screenshot here. It was a newspaper article I found recently when I was pondering what's put in this slide deck. And it's an article from the BBC, and it's about two universities that have renamed, and then two other universities are complaining that they've renamed, and now they're too similar, and all this, the kind of politics of what is your institution called. It's not just about what does it look like in academic literature, it turns out. This is in our national news in the UK, published by the BBC. So it's a public kind of interest thing as well. Both ORCID and ROR are persistent identifiers. There are a number of features of persistent identifiers that make them different from a regular URL. They're globally unique. So each persistent identifier resolves to exactly one entity. They could be a data set, person, an organization, a book. So ISBNs, for example, for books. They're persistent, they stick around. They're not reassigned, very importantly. They're well governed, again, very importantly. They need to be there for the long term, and the community needs to have confidence and trust in the organizations that run them. And they're technically resilient. We handle millions of requests every month, and I'm sure RAW do too. And lastly, I think one of the most important features of PIDs is that they're resolved by humans and machines. So all the RAW IDs Amanda was showing and all the ORCID IDs that I'll be showing here, they're used by machines to understand what information is attached to this organization. But it's the same URL that you'll see and use in the browser works the same for humans. So it's this multi-purpose feature of persistent identifiers that makes them incredibly useful. And together, all these persistent identifiers and the associated metadata really are the building blocks of open research infrastructure. We just saw some really good examples of places reusing RAW. But that powers an awful lot of other things like reporting and integrity checking and all these other kind of use cases. They're powered by solid metadata foundations, and this is where persistent identifiers come in. They need to be reliable, and the information needs to flow from system to system. So I'll talk a bit about the connections. So I've got, I think, 5 of these different ways that we're using RAW that I could come up with. Firstly, raw data really does help users find and enter their affiliations, similar to the examples we're seeing in publisher systems where people search for affiliations. Authors, especially when they're creating ORCID records, need to do this in ORCID. And for a long time, they could only find them in the official way, right? So if you were searching for Manchester University, for example, you would have to search for Manchester University or the University of Manchester, depending on how that university described themselves, right? But there are lots of alternative names. There's lots of different language representations, and there are acronyms that researchers commonly use as their understanding of their employer or where they were educated. And they need to be able to find them by that because that's what they'll actually type in a box, right? So this example is for the University of Quebec, but if you're typing in French and you're typing in English, university is spelt different, right? So you need to be able to find it in the language you commonly use. And this is a fantastic feature, and it means people can find CERN, for example, the physics facility. They can find it by typing in CERN now, rather than an incredibly long, complicated name, which is how it was known before in the ORCID registry. So this is a fantastic piece of functionality for researchers that makes it much more likely that they will add affiliation information to the ORCID record. Secondly, we do actually use ROR IDs as a default organization ID since a few years ago. And then what this means is when researchers are adding affiliations or professional activities, so let's say they a society officer, for example, to their record, these ROR IDs are included by default in the ORCID metadata attached to that ORCID ID and then shared with other ORCID users when they look in the user interface, but also in our metadata when it's consumed by other systems like CRIS systems or funder systems. Thirdly, and this is quite a recent development, I'm quite excited by this, is researchers are now able to share their what we call professional email domains. And the way we've decided to do that is we processed the raw data set, 115,000 organizations, which included website data. And we derived email domains from that and put a little bit of human curation on top. But what this means is when people, when researchers verify their email address, when in the normal process of creating an ORCID record, we add that to their ORCID record and say, this is verified, they've proved they own that inbox. And now there's a green tick next to it. And it's one of the only ways researchers can get a green tick on their record anywhere without the intervention or without connecting with another system. And this is a really useful piece of information. It's not exactly the same as an affiliation. You might have an email address for a university, for example, but not be a researcher. But it is a very good positive signal that the person is a bona fide part of the scholarly community. We also use email domain data to make registration easier. One of the things we really like researchers to do is to enter 2 email addresses. And the reason for this is people move organizations, they move from place to place. And when they move from one university to a different research institution, quite often they lose access to their old email box. And what this means is they can no longer reset their password and things like that. And they can lose access to their ORCID account, which is not what we want them to do. So we really encourage them to add 2 email addresses, a professional email address for their current employer, but also a personal email address so they can recover things if they need to in the future, or maybe they just find that an easier thing to remember when they're signing into things. And the way we do that is very similar to the email domain sharing, is we can identify email domains that belong to academic institutions. And if they enter one, we prompt them to enter a personal email address. And if they don't enter one, we prompt them to enter a professional email address. And that leads on to step 2 here, which is now we've got their professional email address, we can actually link that to a ROR ID and suggest to the user, we think you're from the University of Exeter, for example, and we pre-populate the form, and all they have to do is put in their job title and the date they started work, and now they have affiliation information directly on the ORCID record from the point of account creation, which again is a really useful way of helping researchers disambiguate themselves from other people. And finally, raw data is used, raw IDs specifically, are used by ORCID member organizations when they add validated organization info to ORCID records. So the main case of this happening is a researcher will sign into their research information system, ERA system, CRIS system. They've got slightly different names at their institution. And when they sign in, it will ask them to sign in with their ORCID ID at the same time. As soon as they do that, the university can now automatically connect these 2 identities, their institutional identity and their ORCID identity, and update their ORCID record to say, this person works at my institution. There's an example on this slide from the University of Oxford, but there are hundreds of universities doing this now. And what this does is it adds a stamp of authority on the information on ORCID record, which we refer to as a trust marker. So you can see there's a green tick in the example. And what that means is the University of Oxford is saying this fact is true. The researcher works for the University of Oxford, and it's not just the researcher claiming that. There is an elevated level of trust because it's come directly from the University of Oxford's research systems. So as a result of all this work and the increase in quality of the raw data to the point that we're now using 75,000 different raw IDs in the ORCID registry, we have 7.3 million affiliations in the registry with ROR IDs attached, and that's spread across 5.1 million ORCID records. And you can see from this graph in 2024 what looks like an anomaly, but it's not an anomaly. This is a direct result of us prompting researchers on record creation to add affiliation information and also making it easier for them in the user interface to find their correct affiliation. So as a result of that work and the excellent work ROR are doing, we've doubled the number of affiliations being added to the registry every week, every week and also every year. The other result here is researchers seem to be really keen to register and share their domains. We only launched this feature back in September, and we've made a couple of improvements since. So when we first launched it, we processed all the publicly available email addresses that already existed. But then around November time, we started suggesting that to researchers that they can share their email domain if they want. And we improved the matching algorithm late last year, early this year, to really increase the number of active records with professional email domains. So this currently stands at 1.7 or 1.8 million ORCID records that are sharing a trusted, validated professional domain that is linked directly to a ROR ID, which I think is fantastic. And this is growing. This is really, really growing. So yeah, I fully expect to see this number hit 3 million by the end of the year. So use cases, I think Amanda did slightly better of showcasing some of the use cases than I did, but we do essentially the use cases we support around from the ORCID perspective when it comes to ROR are distributing and sharing the connections between ORCID IDs and ROR IDs. And those are used for various things, right? They're used to help automatically fill out forms. I think Amanda asked for an example, and one of the manuscripts, several of the manuscript submissions do this, where you sign in with an ORCID ID, the manuscript submission system will actually read from your ORCID record your current affiliation and pre-populate the box. Now you can always change it and things like that, but it pre-populated box is just one less step to take, right? So there are grant systems doing this, and it means you can pull this information out if you're populating forms for promotions and things like that as well. But mainly it's used, I think, in the reporting and discovery phases, and also in research integrity checking. So we know that the ORCID metadata, including all the ROR IDs, are ingested by funder, research organization, and publisher systems. We know for a fact they're ingested by a lot of the aggregation and big discovery platforms. They're all using ORCID metadata, which contains those 7.1 million ROR affiliations to help cluster authors and things like that, so they can present better search results to their end users. We also use them to provide reporting to ORCID members, so we know the ROR IDs associated with all ORCID members. So we can actually give them reports about how engaged, for example, their researchers are with ORCID, and how well their own integrations are doing at updating them. And yeah, we just make it available for general use, and the use cases are myriad there. But it's also used in research integrity checking. Human readable RORs and the associated provenance information on a UI that I just demonstrated, where we have affiliations with green ticks, for example. This is used by editors and reviewers who are just visiting ORCID records to view that, but it's also being consumed and used in automated integrity checking systems that all the major publishers are rolling out. There's a lot of existing ones, but there is an awful lot of development, active development on those systems, and they're all pulling in ORCID data and the associated ROR data to help make better decisions. So yeah, these are the use cases I see them, and I think with that, I'll just finish on this kind of promise of persistent identifiers, where essentially the better the metadata and the more connected everything is, the easier everything else gets. And there's been a number of studies done on this that I'm going to put my hands up, not commissioned by ORCID and certainly not commissioned by ROR either. But there's been many studies commissioned by national bodies, like there's a couple here from the UK and Australia, that said if properly implemented, persistent identifiers can save millions and millions of dollars or pounds or euros or whatever a year. And we're really getting there. I think ORCID DOIs and RORs are now mature and ubiquitous. RAID, which is a persistent identifier for projects, are catching up. And grant IDs, created by DOI providers, they're also catching up, and these things are forming a better and better graph that are making it easier and easier to find and discover trusted information. So I'll finish there. I think I've probably talked enough, and we can talk about some questions and answers, if that's okay, Kimberly.
Yes, we have a lot of questions to get to. So thank you both, firstly, for the wonderful presentation, and secondly, for leaving 20 minutes for questions. I will encourage the audience to go ahead and check out that Q&A box, upvote questions that you're interested in, but also check out the ones that have already been answered. Amanda's been sharing a lot of really great links and information there. I think one of our first questions that we can get to is a little bit of context, and then I think if we could just have both Amanda and Tom talk a little bit about how DataCite works with both ROR and ORCID. But this person is saying, RORs are important in identification of affiliations, but also keep in mind that they are critical for connecting organizations to DataCite metadata and several contributing roles, i.e. sponsor, hosting institution, etc. So Amanda, could you share a little bit about how ROR works with DataCite metadata?
Sure, yeah, and hi, Ted. Ted is very much an expert on these issues, on DataCite metadata, and indeed on ROR, and Ted was instrumental in helping integrate ROR into its first adopter, Dryad, so he's making an important point. So ROR IDs we've emphasized the author affiliation use case. Tom mentioned that ROR IDs can also be used to identify funders, but specifically in the DataCite metadata schema, DataCite was also a very early adopter of ROR, really back in 2019. As most of you probably know, DataCite is not only an operating organization for ROR, but it is a DOI registrar that is at least mostly focused on DOIs for things like data sets, although it's kind of content agnostic. And DataCite supports ROR IDs for multiple purposes within its schema. So that means that when you're describing an object, you can use a ROR ID for instance, who is a contributor to this data set. And what organization is the contributor to this data set affiliated with? So author affiliations, but say contributor affiliations really in this case, but also where is this data set hosted can be a really important one. And so as Ted mentioned, hosting institution is very crucial, like where, or where are, this even gets like crazier, where is the instrument from which this data came located, right? What organization hosts the instrument that generated this data? Those kinds of things. DataCite actually also supports ROR IDs as funder identifiers. There's quite a lot of ROR IDs in DataCite for that. And the use of ROR IDs for funders. And then sponsor too, that really is, we tend to say funder, but that's the same thing. Who supported this research that produced this data set or this journal article, and how can you identify them with a ROR ID? So yeah. And ROR IDs are used in multiple different ways within ORCID records as well, which maybe Tom could talk a little bit about. I don't know. But for instance, like in my own ORCID record, I use, I say I am employed by Crossref. Crossref is identified by a ROR ID, but also I was educated at the University of Virginia. That is identified with a ROR ID. Multiple other uses for ROR IDs within ORCID records, I know.
Definitely. I think I use the example where you can say, for example, you've done a professional activity. So maybe you are an officer for a scholarly society. That society might have a ROR ID, right? And then you're connecting those things up there at that level as well.
Yep. Thanks for pointing that out, Ted.
Yeah, thank you for the additional context there. Our next question, I think, Tom, is more directed for you. So it says, for ORCID, sometimes fund ref versions of institutions still come up, even though grid/Ringgold are gone now. Have those remaining fund ref sources largely been removed? And is ROR supposed to be the only source of affiliation info at this point?
Okay, so the answer to this is ever so slightly complicated. They're right. It's correct. We no longer support grid and Ringgold for new affiliations added via the user interface. They're both still supported on our APIs, to be clear, because we have lots of members who have always been they've been adding grids or ringolds for many, many years, and they want to continue using the thing that they've been using, right? And at some point, hopefully they'll transition to ROR, but that's not our decision to make. But in the user interface for new ones, when you add an affiliation specifically, what it will do is we take the raw data set and we match it across with the FundRef data set. And what we try and do is only if we know there's a ROR for an organization, we only make that ROR available in the search results. However, if we cannot match it to a ROR, so it identifies an organization that isn't in ROR, we will show the FundRef, more properly Crossref Funder ID result. But we do that in the funding section specifically. And I think maybe Amanda could talk to you a bit more about the progress of moving Crossref Funder IDs into ROR, because when that's complete, we won't have to do that anymore. We will be able to just rely solely on ROR. But at the moment, it's ever so slightly mixed bag, but it really does try very, very hard to only show RORs where possible. But some people are affiliated with things that are identified in the other systems that are not yet in ROR, sadly.
Yeah. So as Tom mentioned, FundRef, the formerly named FundRef, which is, as you mentioned, more properly called the Crossref Open Funder Registry, has been in use for, I think, 12 years or so, quite a long time. There are, last I checked, about 43,000 entities represented in the funder registry. And as I mentioned, ROR has about 115,000 entities, many of which are duplicates of that funder registry. So of the entities in that funder registry. So partly because of that, Crossref is taking a very slow and careful process of deprecating the funder registry in favor of ROR. Now, we have been doing quite a lot of work over the last 2, maybe 3 years to add those funder IDs to ROR. Right now, if you look at journal articles within Crossref or DataCite that use a funder ID, 94% of those have an equivalent ROR ID. So we've done a lot of the work of matching those ROR ID, or creating ROR IDs where necessary, or updating ROR IDs to match what's in that funder registry. That being said, there's a lot of entities in the funder registry that are either not used or used once, or that have essentially bad data in them. So what we are in the process of doing is figuring out what to do about that. And one example that has been floated is perhaps we should create RAID IDs for those entities that are really not funding organizations, to be quite frank. We don't want to put them in ROR just because they're in the funder registry without carefully reviewing that. Anyway, so yeah, this is a long ongoing process. We do actually have an FAQ about that transition. I'll post that link in the chat, and perhaps that will keep my answer shorter.
Thanks, Amanda and Tom. Our next question, and we've gotten a few of these, both at registration and live, is generally asking, will ORCID or ROR have an integration with such and such vendor or system? And I think, at least from the ORCID side, I can say, while we do have conversations with vendors and vendor systems and say that they should integrate with us, I think it will always mean more to the vendor if they hear from you, their user, that you want this integration. So no, we have those conversations, but use your power as a user to let them know what you want out of their system. But specifically, Tom, someone is asking if there will be an integration of ResearchGate with ORCID.
So I haven't had any conversations with ResearchGate myself. That doesn't mean my colleagues haven't. I couldn't really say. But again, just to echo what you said, Kimberly, that's really up to ResearchGate and ResearchGate's users asking ResearchGate to do so. I think there are ORCID IDs in ResearchGate in various places, but an official integration, I think, would be hugely valued. We do get asked for that by our users. We do user surveys every few months, and along with some other systems, large systems like LinkedIn or Google Scholar, for example. ResearchGate gets mentioned. So yeah, it's something we do. We are actually targeting strategic partners, and ResearchGate, I think, should be in that category. But it's not something I'm directly involved in, I'm afraid, so I can't really answer.
And then Amanda, is it similar for ROR when people would like to see integrations of ROR in other places? Is it best for them to advocate with the systems they want to see it in?
Yes, absolutely. And I will add my voice to those requests. One of the so ResearchGate, I actually should follow up with them about them. ResearchGate, as it happens, not that you asked about this, but ResearchGate does have some kind of a ROR integration. We're not. I need to figure out a bit more how that works, and they were interested in adding additional organizations to ROR to facilitate whatever they're doing in ResearchGate. Some of the systems that we would love to see ROR integrated in sooner rather than later are even more of those manuscript submission systems that are used in publishing. Almost all of the people I've talked to have said it's coming, it's on our roadmap. We've had, I think I can count, there's 2 or 3 people who are relatively small actors who have said we don't have plans to integrate ROR. Just sometimes it takes quite a bit of time. But yes, usually the very best way to get ROR into a system is to contact the representatives of that system. We have some materials that we can share in multiple languages, making the case for ROR. So I can share that link with Kimberly as well. So you can, and then you can always contact me if you need additional information about ROR or additional persuasive points about ROR.
I noticed there's a somewhat related, from a different direction kind of question in the chat, where someone's asking about a university that doesn't exist in ORCID and what should they do. The example is Damascus. And I would suggest that you talk to ROR or someone from talk to someone at the university to talk to ROR to get that university added to the ROR system. And ORCID, once a month, we update, we pull in all the new information from ROR. And so once it's in ROR, it will make its way to ORCID. And the information can be properly managed in ROR about organizations in one place. And then it will appear in ORCID, and users can start entering that information in their ORCID records.
Yeah. Is it once a month? I thought it was every 2 weeks for some reason, but
you might be more right than me there.
Somebody had asked that recently. Check. So it is, it can be a slow process. That's true. And Thomas is correct. And we actually field questions referred by ORCID's wonderful support team quite often. People will say, I'm looking for my organization that's not here. ORCID support then refers them to us. And somebody was asking about the length of time that takes. And it is true that takes some time. If you have an ORCID record, you can update your ORCID record right away. You can do it right now. And you can enter institutions that are not in ROR. That's important to know. You can type in an organization, hit enter, that's fine. Yep. But we at ROR do this central curation. We're quite careful about it. And I have to say too, ROR is very hot right now. We are currently processing over 1,000 requests a month, which is about triple the amount of requests that we had last year. So right now our processing time, especially for new records, tends to be about 4 to 6 weeks. And then, as Tom mentioned, ORCID regularly refreshes its ROR IDs. So once we create that new ROR ID, it may take 2 weeks or so. I think it's 2 weeks. I'm going to double check. I hope.
I think you're right now you say that.
Yeah. So, it could depend. So we could publish it on a Monday, and then ORCID could happen to update its record on a Wednesday. So it's always difficult to tell. But yeah, it can take up to 2 months for that to appear in ORCID. But that is because we are very careful to make sure that, especially when adding a new organization, that it is a genuine research organization that publishes reputable research, and that we have all of the information correct. So that central curation is really key for the quality of ROR records. But it is also very easy for you to request it. If you go to ror.org/search, there is a link on any record that goes to a form where you can make that request. You can request a new ROR ID, you can request a change to an existing ROR ID. And so it's very easy to request the change. We do just need to take some time to process that.
Great. And we'll include that link in the follow-up materials as well, so people have easy access to it. This next question is about ROR and ROR records. They say, I'm curious whether there may be a bias in the representation of records in ROR towards certain countries. I recently learned about Japan's INSTEP project, which seems to have contributed systematically to ROR. From the perspective of a national institution, how could we initiate a similar project to update or enhance the representation of our country's institutional records in ROR?
Ah, that is such a great question. So one thing that I skimmed over a bit in the history of ROR is that when ROR launched in 2019, we launched as a synchronized file with, well, and API. We were synchronized with an initiative called GRID, which was an organization identifier database initiative that was open and it was public, but it was run by the company Digital Science, which is a private company that produces products like Dimensions and Figshare. And what they wanted to do was to sort of get out of the organization identifier business, hand that over to something that was community oriented. So they were very generous and helpful in the initial days of ROR. But the GRID database was skewed toward, I would say, Western organizations. One of the main things that we've been doing in the last roughly 3 years since we diverged from GRID and are no longer synchronized with them is adding organizations from Asia, from Africa, Asia in particular, and even from and updating all the language has been really key, really making sure that ROR is multilingual. We do also have, we do bulk projects, bulk quality projects. We get lots of requests for those too. But I will give Kimberly a link to share with you where there are spreadsheets when you want to request not just, you know, a change to a single ROR record, but you want to say, let's add all of these 100 records. We did an project to add African funders to ROR. We partnered, this is last year, we partnered with the Africa PID Alliance to do that. That was fantastic. So yeah, we're very open to these bulk projects. Those can take even longer than 2 months to do because it depends on how many, you know, are you requesting 5? Are you requesting 100? Are you requesting 200? So yeah, we have been concentrating on Japanese organizations and Portuguese organizations this year in particular, but both of those are quite far along. So I'm going to share a link where you can request a bulk ROR project to add multiple organizations. And we can work with you on that for free.
That sounds great.
By the way, for free, entirely for free.
That's good to know, and I'll be sure to include that link in the follow-up materials as well for everyone. I think we have time for one more question, and this one is just asking for some advice. For an institutional CRIS system and repositories, which PIDs would you definitely recommend that they record?
I'm happy to take that one. If you, I'm assuming Kimberly will send out the slides later. If not, we could send it out as a link. But the slide I referenced with the promise of PIDs, that's actually referenced as a report that was written, and that report identifies 5 priority PIDs. 3 of them which are pretty much mature now, which would be the DOIs, the ORCIDs, and the RORs. So that's for the things, the people and the places, and the other 2 would be project identifiers and grant/funding award identifiers. Those are the 5 main entities required to create a reasonable knowledge graph. You can have system identifiers for everything if you want, right? So there's very solid use cases, for example, for system identifiers of instruments and equipment or facilities. But these tend to be slightly more specialist, but at the higher level, the thing that will link all these things together are those 5: people, places, things, projects, which are collections of basically people, places, and things, and grants, and projects are sort of a container for all of those things together. So I would look at those, specifically the mature ones that exist now, but with an eye on, you know, RAID is very quickly approaching maturity for project identifiers, and grant identifiers continue to become adopted by funders. So yeah, those.
Yeah, and if I could mention a little bit about grant identifiers, both DataCite and Crossref have grant identifier initiatives. And one perhaps slightly confusing thing is that those grant identifiers are DOIs, right? So there are grant identifiers when you get a grant, an award from a funder. Very often they have their own local award numbers, but those are not globally unique usually, and not necessarily persistent. So there, in a lot of scholarly metadata, there are award numbers saying this project was funded by such and such award number, but those are not globally unique, resolvable, persistent identifiers. So both Crossref and DataCite, recognizing the importance of creating globally unique, persistent identifiers for grants, have projects with funders to get them to register DOIs for those grants. So yeah, I think that is a really key emerging persistent identifier use case really for DOIs.
Great. Well, thank you both for, firstly, a very productive Q&A session. We've gotten through a lot of great questions today. And thank you both for your time giving this presentation. It's been very helpful and very informative. Amanda, I've copied a lot of the links that you've shared, and I'll ensure that they get included in the follow-up materials. And yeah, I just want to say thanks again for everyone for joining us. Thanks to Amanda, thanks to Tom, and we hope to see everyone at a future event. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.